Richard Milhous Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, and he was born on January 9th, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California.
Oh, my sweet little boy, I'll name you Richard Milhouse Nixon.
After graduating high school, Richard then attended Whitner College and graduated from Whitner College in 1934. He then went to Duke University to study law. After Duke, Richard returned to Whitner and then became a small-town lawyer.
Richard Nixon. Congratulations, you just graduated from Duke University School of Law.
Thank you, ma'am.
In 1942, Nixon moved to Washington, D.C., where he took a job at FDR's Office of Price Administration. He then decided he needed to join the U.S. Navy.
I need to serve my country.
Richard Nixon was in the Navy, but unlike many other future presidents, he never saw action in the war. Nixon was the officer in charge of the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command at Guadalcanal in the Solomons, and later at Green Island. He was then transferred to a naval air station in California in 1944.
Life at sea sure can be boring when you see no action. Time for me to go home.
When Nixon returned home, he decided to go into politics. He remained in the Navy Reserve until 1966.
After brief consideration, I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, have decided to run for a seat in the House of Representatives.
Richard Nixon served in the House of Representatives from 1947 to 1953, until Dwight E. Eisenhower asked him to be his running mate in the upcoming election.
Hello, Mr. Nixon.
Hi, Mr. Eisenhower.
How are
How's it
you?
going?
Good, how are you? I was just wondering if you wanted to be my vice president.
Oh, that'd be great, Mr. Eisenhower.
Awesome, looking forward to it.
Before Eisenhower and Nixon were elected, Nixon was accused of taking money from his campaign funds. Many people called Nixon a crook. Then Nixon gave the Checkers speech, assuring them that he was not taking the money.
My fellow Americans, I have come before you tonight as a candidate of the vice presidency and as a man whose honest and integrity has been questioned. Now, the usual political thing to do when charges are made against you is to either ignore them or deny them without giving details. I believe we have had enough of this in the United States, particularly with the present administration in Washington, D.C. To me, the office of Vice Presidency of the United States is a great office, and I feel the people have got to have confidence in integrity of the men who run the office and who might attain them. I have a theory too, that the best and only answer to a smear or an honest misunderstanding of the facts to tell the truth. And that is why I'm here tonight. I want to tell you my side of the case.
Did you do it?
No, I did not do it. A group of people raised $18,000 for me for my political activities so I could travel and do other things with that money.
Why did you do it?
No, I did not. And to answer those questions, let me say this. Not a cent of the $18,000 or any money of that type ever went to me or my personal use. Every penny it was used to pay for a political expense, and I did not think it should be charged to the taxpayers of the United States. The question is, was it morally wrong? I say it was morally wrong if any of the $18,000 went to Senator Nixon for my personal use. I say that it was morally wrong if it was secretly given and secretly handled. And I say that it was morally wrong if any of the contributors got special favors from the contributions that they made.
After Eisenhower's 8 years as president, Nixon then ran for president himself and won the Republican nomination in 1960, but now was facing Democrat nominee JFK.
Welcome to this nation's first televised presidential debate. Today we have Democratic nominee John F. Kennedy, and we have the Republican nominee Richard M. Nixon. The first question is for Senator Kennedy. Why should people vote for you instead of the vice president?
Myself and the vice president came in the Senate in 1946, so our experience in the government has been the same. We both were on the Labor Committee. I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Harry Truman. They supported and sustained these programs which I have discussed this evening.
The next question for Richard Nixon. Your campaign stressed the value of your 8-year experience as vice president. The question is, was that experience as an observer, a participant?
On many of my foreign trips, when I have returned home, I have proposed many policies that have been adopted within this presidential administration that I consider to be effective. So yes, I would say that in a I am an indicator of certain policies in this country.
Nixon had lost the election against JFK, and 2 years later ran for governor of California, and he also lost that. In 1968, he decided to run for president once more.
In 1968, Richard Nixon had won the presidency by defeating Herbert Humphrey from the Democratic Party and the third-party candidate George Wallace.
As Nixon took the presidential office, the United States was at a rough time as the American people were torn apart about the Vietnam War, and peace riots happened very often. Nixon came up with a plan to remove American troops from the war. He used a term called Vietnamization, where he would slowly take our troops out of the South Vietnam and train the Vietnamese to fight for themselves.
Tonight, I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. Tonight, I would like to answer the question of how to end the war in Vietnam. We have adopted a plan, which we have worked on in cooperation with the South Vietnamese, for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces, and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly scheduled timetable. This withdrawal will be made from strength and not from weakness. As South Vietnamese forces become stronger, the rate of American withdrawal can become greater. At 5 years of Americans going into Vietnam, we are finally bringing American men home. By December 15th, over 60,000 men will have been withdrawn from South Vietnam, including 20% of all of our combat forces. Tonight, I do not tell you that the war in Vietnam is the war to end all wars. But I do say this: I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to the great goal to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace.
Nixon wanted to end the war with peace and honor, so Nixon's plan was to slowly take out our forces while the last men there would train the South Vietnamese soldiers. He wanted to hand over the responsibility of fighting to the South Vietnamese. In January 1973, the Nixon administration was attempting peace negotiations with North Vietnam. During peace negotiations between the U.S. and North Vietnam, there was a concern from the U.S. government about the U.S. missing troops in Vietnam, and a few weeks after the war ended for the U.S., 591 POWs returned to the United States. There was still concern, however, as there were still many soldiers unaccounted for in Vietnam.
Honey, I'm home.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. How have you been?
He went okay.
All right. How's our kid doing?
He's great.
Where's
He's
he
gotten
at?
so big.
Daddy, you're home! Oh my God! Look how big he's gotten.
I know, right,
Oh
Daddy?
my gosh!
About time you come
Oh
home.
no, I'm happy to see you. I've just been at war for the
I'm
last
so
year.
happy.
Watergate was a very large-scale political scandal that happened during the early 70s. Several burglars were arrested in Washington, D.C. at the Watergate Complex building. These burglars were working for President Nixon. They stole top-secret documents and tapped into phones to find out different kinds of information to see what Nixon needed to do to get reelected. The burglars had trouble with one of their taps, so they went back in with a new microphone, and that's when they got caught. Years later, the scandal began to unravel. People were demanding the tapes that recorded conversation in Nixon's office. Nixon's lawyer fought it, saying he had executive rights, but eventually the Supreme Court ordered him to give up the tapes. The tapes give evidence to Nixon's crimes, so the House of Representatives voted to impeach Nixon.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I've spoken to you from this office, in which so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so, to discuss with you some matters that I believe affected the national interest, and all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to preserve, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. I've never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is complete is opposed to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of Americans first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Nixon resigned from presidency on August 9, 1974. He handed over the presidency to his vice president, Gerald Ford. Nixon resigned before he was removed from office, as the tapes gave undeniable evidence of Nixon's ties to the Watergate crimes.
Gerald Ford, repeat after me. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States,
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States,
and that I will, to the best of my abilities, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United
and
States.
to the best of my abilities, protect, preserve, defend the Constitution of the United States.
Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, but however his staff members were not as lucky, as most of them were charged with federal crimes.
You are hereby now pardoned.
Thank you, sir.
Nixon and his wife then returned to their home in San Clemente, California. As time went on, Nixon built his character back up, and some presidents have been seen talking or asking Nixon for advice. Nixon died on April 22, 1994, due to complications with a stroke. Richard Nixon had a great impact on foreign policy and helped bring an end to the war in Vietnam.